Key findings. On the electoral process, from our own observations, there was a peaceful pre-election atmosphere. Throughout the voting process, we met professional, diligent, and friendly election officials and security officers. We observed that voters' lists were visible, well-placed, of high quality, and arranged in alphabetical order. They were accessible at polling stations, all of which made identification of voters easier than would have been. We sensed a strong feeling of excitement among all the people we interacted with. We learned about the death of an opposition supporter earlier this month from a number of stakeholders, as was confirmed by the Commissioner General of Police, who advised that an investigation is still underway. We hope that there will be an expeditious and just outcome to this investigation. In terms of equitable media coverage of all political parties and actors, the group notes with a bit of concern that there is still room for much improvement in leveling the playing field. It was noteworthy that several mechanisms to deal with election disputes are in place, including the electoral courts. And although there have been reports that national-level multi-party liaison committees have had limited success in resolving disputes than we would have expected. Prior to Election Day, the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission had provided various assurances of its preparedness and readiness to conduct the elections as scheduled. However, on Election Day, the late opening of polls, due to the late arrival of ballot papers in the major urban areas of Harare and Bulawayo, raised concerns and heightened tensions. We note that these areas represent a significant proportion of the overall population. And while we were informed of ZEC's explanation regarding challenges with logistics and the impact of late court cases, we would welcome a more detailed explanation from ZEC in the coming days, and we will further reflect on this matter in our final report, which remains a matter of concern to all of us. Election Day proceeded in an atmosphere of relative peace and calm, and we observed the turnout of many voters, especially women and youth. We felt that this was testimony to the desire of all Zimbabweans to make their voices heard and contribute to the country's ongoing democratic consolidation. We commend highly the people of Zimbabwe for the enthusiasm and largely peaceful approach in the exercise of their franchise. Greater information sharing by institutions and stakeholders, in particular ZEC, on all aspects of the electoral process, including on the issue of voter roll, would improve transparency and trust. We observed and received various reports that an NGO called Forever Associate Zimbabwe, FAZ, had set up exit poll survey tables in close proximity to polling stations and had governing party regalia. From our briefings with other civil society organizations and stakeholders, it was made clear that exit polling is currently not permitted within the legal framework of Zimbabwe. Let me now turn to each of the key areas of the electoral process in a little more detail. On the overall pre-election environment, we note that these elections were conducted against the background of a peace pledge agreed by political parties, as well as conflict resolution and prevention mechanisms, including the multi-party liaison committees. We also note that these elections were characterized by a number of legal challenges, several of which were unresolved by Election Day and remain unresolved to date. We'll comment on this in our final report. It was commendable that political parties and other stakeholders committed to peaceful elections by signing the Peace Pledge on the 4th of August 2023. I laud the commitment of all Zimbabweans in ensuring that Election Day proceeded largely peacefully, and urge all political parties and their supporters to honor this pledge in the coming days and to use available legal means for any conflict resolution. Although this was the third election organized by an independent election management body, ZEC, we note that a combination of legislative and administrative reforms would be needed to improve its performance. Recalling the Commonwealth Observer Group report of Zimbabwe's 2018 harmonized elections, stakeholders once again expressed the view that ZEC could have done more to build trust and instill confidence in the electoral process through effective communication and a better information flow. We will provide a detailed assessment of this also in our final report. The legal framework. The legal and electoral framework, primarily the 2013 Constitution of the Republic of Zimbabwe as amended, the Electoral Act, Chapter 213 as amended, provide the basic legal conditions for credible and peaceful elections. We note that since the 2018 elections, amendments were made to the legal framework with legislation such as the Maintenance of Peace and Order Act, enacted in 2019, which replaced the previous Public Order and Security Act. This new legislation has had an impact on the electoral landscape. The enactment of new laws or amendments 6 months prior to the harmonized elections was raised as an issue by stakeholders who felt it created an uncertain legal environment in terms of interpretation of the law. This includes the Criminal Law, Codification and Reform Amendment Act, or the Patriotic Act as it's commonly known, as well as the Private Voluntary Organization, PVO Bill, which though not yet enacted, was de facto being applied. Independence of ZEC. Stakeholders expressed concern over the appointment of ZEC commissioners and the Secretariat, and a suggested lack of independence of ZEC, particularly in relation to its own Secretariat and the relationship between the Secretariat and the public. It was felt strongly that public confidence in ZEC needs strengthening. The significant increase in nomination fees was reported to us by most stakeholders as an obstacle. The group was advised that the hike in nomination fees had proved a barrier to nomination, most acutely amongst women, amongst young people, and persons with disabilities, who are, in fact, the majority of voters in this country. We were informed that the exercise of border delimitation was conducted without a published final census report, and there could be wide discrepancies between the number of voters in constituencies. We will assess this aspect in greater detail in our final report. On the voters' roll, though it was available to parties and candidates, we were told that there was a lack of clarity as to how voters would determine where they could vote. We also observed that party agents did not have copies of the voter roll for their respective stations, indicating that parties and candidates could not inform and remind voters of their polling stations to promote a better turnout on election day. We also observed that the names of some voters who had confirmed their polling station via mobile phone using the SMS code provided by ZEC did not appear on the lists on election day. Accreditation, and I'll begin with the media. We note concerns raised about the so-called double accreditation process for the media, whereby Zimbabwean journalists already accredited with the ZMC were required to pay an additional $10 to accredit with ZEC to observe the elections and gain access to elections-related information or events. The cost of the double accreditation for international media houses wishing to cover the election was regarded, for local and international media houses wishing to cover the election, was regarded as prohibitive. Additionally, it was noted that several journalists from foreign media houses were denied accreditation, notably The Voice of America, South Africa's Daily Maverick, and ARD of Germany. The campaign. In briefings, it was alleged that for those campaign rallies that were denied by Zimbabwean police, they had made selective use of the Maintenance of Peace and Order Act of 2019, and that this selective use created an unlevel playing field. However, the police stated, in our meeting with them, that there were legitimate reasons for rallies being denied, such as failure to meet certain criteria. The group will address this issue in more detail in its final report. Mainstream media, radio, television, and newspapers remain the most important communication channels to inform the electorate about the policies and platforms of political parties and candidates running for office. It's therefore essential that media present at all viewpoints during a campaign so that voters can make an informed choice. I'll read that again. It's therefore essential that media is present at all viewpoints during a campaign so that voters can make an informed choice. Stakeholders reiterated concerns about state media bias favoring the governing party. Political parties, indeed, noted that although airtime was made available, many media outlets required payment for slots, which proved unaffordable. This imbalance in coverage started well before the campaign began. The group notes that once the president had gazetted the election proclamation date, the ZMC cedes control of media regulation, which then falls under the electoral legal framework, including, but not limited to, the Constitution, the Electoral Act, Media Regulation Statutory Instrument 33 of 2008. The group noted that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, ZEC, established a media monitoring committee to monitor the coverage of the elections. The committee is chaired by the ZEC and comprises the Zimbabwe Media Commission and the Broadcasting Authority of Zimbabwe. WhatsApp dominated the rapid spread of disinformation during the 2023 elections, with the app's inscription and closed group functionality making mis- and disinformation harder for fact-checking organizations such as ZimFact to counter. Participation and inclusion. In the presidential election, the group notes there were 4 women candidates in the previous election, but just 1 woman candidate in 2023. We understood that there were multiple barriers to women's political representation, such as cultural biases, targeted abuse, and lack of resources. This issue will also be analyzed in our final report and recommendations made thereon. We welcome the inclusion of the 10% youth quota to the National Assembly. At the local government level, we also welcome the introduction of a 30% quota for women. It's commendable that there are reserved seats for persons with disabilities in the Senate. Additionally, the ballot templates were provided for visually impaired voters at polling stations, and ZEC had also accommodated wheelchair-bound voters. On arrival at their various deployment stations, our teams visited provincial and district-level ZEC offices, local police stations, and in some cases, the local offices of some of the political parties, among others. Most of the polling stations had been set up by the eve of the elections. Materials had been received by polling officials, and polling officials as well as the police were at post, and in some cases, party agents were also present. On the eve of elections, we found that ZEC appeared to be prepared. Our observers reported that the opening of polls commenced on time in most of the polling stations observed, with the exception of Harare Metropolitan Province, and Bulawayo Metropolitan Province. Due to the late start of polling in some areas, particularly in Harare and Bulawayo, there were still long queues at some polling stations by 7 p.m., which was the stipulated closing time. In some cases, ballot papers did not arrive until the afternoon, in one instance as late as 7:30 p.m. This could have had an effect on voter turnout in these large urban areas. It could also have had an impact on voters, some of whom appeared agitated. We noted from reports that ZEC attributed the delays to the impact of numerous court challenges on the printing process. As mentioned above, we look forward to further clarity from ZEC on this issue. It was observed that polling officials were directed to keep polling open for a full 12 hours in accordance with the law. We noted the President of Zimbabwe's announcement on the evening of Election Day, in which the polling period was extended in the affected areas for the elections of President, National Assembly, and local councillors. The consequence of the above was that the affected polling officials and agents had to work in excess of 24-hour shifts. Polling officials we spoke to stated that they did not receive any notification from ZEC that they would be rotated at any point. The welfare of polling staff and agents therefore became an issue of concern to us, and this could have potentially impacted the accuracy and speed of the counting process. Nonetheless, we were impressed by the resilience, dedication, and professionalism of polling staff despite the very long hours. In addition, we note that voting after dark may have been a barrier to women voters, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Given the issues with delayed starts to polling in a number of areas, we could have welcomed a more robust and timely communication strategy from ZEC on Election Day. Voter lists and verification. At many polling stations, voters took it upon themselves to check their names on the voter roll affixed to the tent, building, or nearby wall before joining the queue. The prominence of the voter rolls is commendable, and this, along with the mobile SMS code provided by ZEC, may be why its officials recorded very few instances of voters having to be redirected to correct polling stations. That said, the mobile SMS code appeared to work well prior to Election Day, but not on the day itself. Observers noted that the names of some voters who had confirmed their polling station via mobile phone using the SMS code did not appear on the lists on Election Day. Our observers reported that the voter verification process was smooth and proceeded in line with the prescribed process. Polling procedures in those areas not affected by the late provision of ballots, generally speaking, all pre-poll procedures were adhered to, and polling staff seemed well trained. Polling staff was efficient, meticulous, and highly transparent in the conduct of their duties. However, we noted some minor disagreements between officials and agents as to how to complete results forms owing to perceived ambiguities. Some polling stations were in tents, while others were indoors in public buildings. Despite this, there was relative uniformity in the layout of polling stations. The secrecy of the ballot was assured. Certain deficiencies with polling station tents as compared to buildings will be detailed in our final report. Participation and inclusion. Large numbers of voters turned out on Election Day, and it was pleasing to note the mix of voters who turned up. In some areas, the youth turnout appeared to be very high, whilst in other areas, older generations appeared to represent the majority of voters. We are pleased to see ZEC disaggregate voters by age and gender, and look forward to receiving and reviewing these statistics once publicly available. In most cases, priority was accorded to pregnant women, nursing mothers, persons with disability, and the elderly. Although we also noted some polling stations lacked an efficient system for identifying priority voters, resulting in them queuing for long periods of time. There was some inconsistency in the support provided to persons with disabilities outside and inside polling stations. At some polling stations, men and women were separated into different queues. ZEC is to be commended for its efforts in fostering greater inclusion, especially for persons with disability, by making available assistive devices at polling stations, including Braille ballot guides. Voter intimidation on election day. Our observers witnessed tables set up in close proximity by an organization called Forever Associates Zimbabwe, and received reports that members of the organization were allegedly recording the names and ID numbers of voters. We also noted that members of FAS were conducting citizen observation. The presence fueled allegations of voter intimidation. Party agents of the main political parties were present in all polling stations observed. Whilst they lacked copies of the voter roll, they were nonetheless diligent to the extent evident in the conduct of their duties. Security was present at every polling station observed. In most areas, they were professional, unobstructive, and carried out their duties diligently. We note that in some instances, security personnel were situated inside polling stations, although they did not appear to interfere or to be an intrusive presence. Close of polls. The count was a detailed and thorough process carried out by professional, dedicated, and resilient polling officials in the presence of attentive party agents and observers. The close and count followed due process for the most part, with a high degree of transparency. However, it was noted that at some stations, particularly those in tents, lighting was insufficient, which may have delayed the counting process. Arrest and detention of local observers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are following with concern the course of the detention of 41 local civil society observers during a series of raids in Harare on the night of the 23rd of August, including at this hotel. We hope that the legal justification for their detention will become clearer as further information comes to light, and we will definitely be interested in that information and hope that it can be provided to us soon. In conclusion, our overall assessment of the voting process is that it was well conducted and peaceful. However, there exist a number of significant issues that impact on the credibility, transparency, and inclusivity of the process. It has been an honor for us to be part of this important process. As we have already noted, this was a critical moment for the people of Zimbabwe. Elections are an opportunity for you to choose your leaders, but to do so in a peaceful environment, in which the rights of all citizens are respected and the role of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission and other key participants in the electoral process is respected and is supported. I would therefore encourage all political leaders and their supporters to continue exercising patience and restraint in the days ahead to allow the result process to be brought to its natural conclusion in accordance with legal provisions and all the laws of Zimbabwe. The Commonwealth family continues to stand in solidarity with you, the people of Zimbabwe. We wish you well, and thank you very much for all the attention that we've received since our arrival here in Zimbabwe.